Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our March WAMESA seminar. So my name is Melanie Finch and I'm the president of WAMESA. So we at WAMESA recognise that Indigenous people were the first Australian and New Zealand earth and environmental scientists, and we have a lot to learn from their deep knowledge that spans tens of thousands of years. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. WAMESA is an Australasian organisation, so I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge Maori as Tanata, Whenua and Titiriti Tangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So the WAMESA seminar series is about showcasing the amazing work of women in earth and environmental science in Australasia. We record our seminars and put them on our YouTube channel, so if you want to catch up on any of our previous seminars, you can have a look there. Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Marji Puotinen, who is a research scientist at the Australian Institute of Marine Science. Marji models how cyclone-generated waves can both damage coral reefs and beneficially cool them during times of thermal stress, and how the spatial and temporal patterning of this is changing as the climate warms. In her spare time, she teaches kids about climate change by exploring interactively with them what penguins and coral reefs have in common. This and other outreach activities were sparked by joining International Leadership Program for Women in STEM, Homeward. And I think we'll be hearing more about her work in that field today. So I will now hand over to you, Marji.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak and for everything that your organization does. And I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from, which is the Noongar people over in Western Australia in the Perth suburbs. Okay, so when you asked me what is the title of my talk, I thought, oh, because the brief was that I could talk about both my research and my outreach. So what I came up with is kind of a wild ride, which could be thought of a bit like an abstract of my paid and unpaid professional working life. So when I started my PhD at James Cook University way back when, I was intrigued by the idea of tropical cyclones because I came in as a geographer, and cyclones are actually fairly predictable in their spatial structure, where you find high winds and big waves, for example. So that's good. But when you think about what impacts they actually have on biological structures like the underwater gardens of coral reefs, it's actually incredibly complex and patchy in space and time as the waves cyclones generate interact with the complicated underwater topography that reefs have. So it's actually a tantalizing problem that you think you have a chance to solve, but the more you look into it, the more impossible it becomes. So you never get bored. But when I started this, I got 2 years into it and my supervisor left the university and I got hired to take his place. So as a new academic teaching full time and trying to do my PhD on the side, and hired into a role where you're supposed to already have your PhD, plus working on a problem that was really tricky, set me up a bit for some imposter syndrome, where I felt like, ooh, you know, nothing I could do was ever enough. And it was really hard to solve the problem as well. So I poured a lot of effort into teaching and outreach activities, and I found those were really well received. However, when I finally got my PhD 10 years later and I moved to University of Wollongong, the kind of narrative coming from academia that I internalized was well, all that outreach is just what you're doing because you're really a failed researcher. And the only thing that really counts is that you need to get lots of grants and publications. So I stopped doing all that. And then in mid 2018, I was accepted into an international leadership program for women in science called Homeward. And so they aim to create a network of now 10,000 women in STEM to help women take leadership positions to manage the earth for the greater good. And so that for each year of the program, it involves a virtual program for a year and then a voyage to Antarctica. So that's where Antarctica comes in and penguins come in. And so I was so inspired to be able to join this amazing group in its third year. Now it's on its seventh year. And inspired by the women that were already in it, I wanted to do something exciting and impactful as part of my voyage. And I racked my brain about what could I do? And then I realized I knew what I could do. I was really good at it, and people loved my outreach activities. So I created my What Do Penguins and Coral Reefs Have in Common program. And then, as I'll talk about later in the talk, my drawing contest initiatives that reach out to kids around the world. And so joining Homeward Bound, doing the program, and then continuing the conversations with other people and with myself that it sparked has really led me to think about leadership. And what does that really mean? And when I Googled leadership clip art, the majority of the pictures I found were like this, where there's someone who knows the answer, who's leading the way, and the other people are following along. And one of the things that I've learned and am continuing to think about from Homeward Bound is that actually, I don't know if that model of leadership makes sense to me. I more think of leadership as no one knows all the answers. Someone is the leader that is trying to empower and inspire and collaborate with the people on their team to work towards achieving values that will benefit everyone. And so that's a very different model. And I'm excited about thinking about leadership in that way, rather than, I never have felt like I know it all about anything. So if that was the definition, I would never be a leader. Okay, so before I launch into talking about cyclones and coral reefs, it's important to have some context, and that means we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which in Australia especially is hardly ever talked about, except in the last few years. So we don't talk about Bruno, we don't talk about climate change, which is, over our shoulders as the poor earth bearing down on us, threatening our very existence. And I'm sure you're all well aware of this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is the famous hockey stick diagram showing carbon dioxide levels gleaned from ice cores drilled deep, deep down into the ice so that we could see what the air composition was up to 400,000 years ago. And you can see that carbon dioxide levels cycled up and down with climate changes, volcanic eruptions, etc., until we reach the Industrial Revolution, when we get this dramatic straight upward spike, which looks like a hockey stick. And so the reason why this is interesting is that when you track those carbon dioxide levels against temperature, they track with each other really well. So the blue line, CO2, and the red temperature line. And of course, why does the temperature rise on Earth with increased CO2? It's because we have an atmosphere that acts like an insulating blanket, when the sun shines in, some of it escapes back at nighttime, but the atmosphere retains some heat so that we don't freeze solid every single night. But CO2 and other greenhouse gases are incredibly good at retaining heat. And so in effect, they're making our atmospheric blanket warmer than it needs to be. And we're really starting to notice it with crazy impacts on our weather just in the last couple of years. So that's going on. You might have seen these climate spirals where it shows you the year, and these colored lines get closer and closer to red as they get warmer. And the average Earth temperature is represented by these circles, the 1.5 degrees being an average Earth temperature post-industrial that is a safe temperature rise where we can adapt to and manage the impacts that creates on our weather and our Earth systems. So that's why the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has been giving more and more dire warnings of late that we need to try and keep 1.5 alive, for example. But after the last COP climate meeting, UN climate meeting, we're on track optimistically, if we're optimistic, for a 3-degree rise. So there's a lot of work to do. And this picture just shows you that our food supplies, sea level, heat waves, biodiversity, all are under threat. And it makes a big difference if you let it rise even fractions of a degree more. So every little bit makes a difference. And near and dear to my heart, of course, is coral reefs, which if we reach 2 degrees rise of the average Earth temperature, we're likely to lose 99% of them, essentially losing them as we know it. So why haven't we noticed this until recently? Because the world's oceans are doing an amazing job at sucking up all that extra heat. In fact, 93.4% of it, well, when this graphic was made anyway, have gone into the oceans and only a fraction into the atmosphere, continents, and ice sheets. But despite that, we've seen massive ice losses, which I'm sure you've heard about. This is in the Arctic. The color here represents sea ice concentration, with white being 100%. And you can see that yellow line is the median extent over a much longer time series. And obviously it's smaller than that median extent. And here is ice loss in meters per year in Antarctica from 2003 to 2019. So the blue areas, you get a slight gain, but there's big areas of loss down to the red and the purple. But another impact that comes from this warming of the ocean is on coral reefs, as I've mentioned. If you're not already familiar with why that happens, I'll give you a brief crash course. So here is a great figure from the 2018 IPCC report, and it shows you moving up and down the average Earth temperature rise. So 1 degree is around here, 1.5 and 2. And it shows you different ecosystems. I've highlighted warm water coral reefs, and then the colors indicate the severity and irreversibility and how widespread the impacts are expected to be. So already at the temperature that we are at now, we've got high impacts that are difficult to recover from for coral reefs. And if we get up to 2 degrees, as I said before, we lose virtually everything. And that's because coral reefs, even though they love living in warm tropical sunlit waters, can't tolerate temperatures that are much above their normal temperature range for too long. So if the water gets more than 1 degree Celsius hotter than they're used to, and that lasts for at least 4 weeks in a row, they can start to become sick and die, and they turn bright white, which we call bleaching. So why is that, and how does that happen? So coral reefs are actually really wild organisms. I ask kids to vote, is a coral reef a rock, an animal, or a plant? And then we go through and discover the answer. And you probably already know that they're actually all three of those things at the same time. So coral colonies, when you look at them individually or in their big aggregations that form these rocky reefs, they can actually be seen from space. And if you've ever surfed around one or stood on one, you know that they're hard and they can even block huge waves. So coral colonies act like rocks to form rocky reef structures. But if you zoom in really close on an individual colony, you'll find that there's millions to billions of tiny, tiny little creatures with tentacles living in them called coral polyps. And those coral polyps can feed with their tentacles, but they actually get 95% or so of their energy by doing photosynthesis. Well, they don't do the photosynthesis. They actually have billions to trillions of tiny little microscopic plants called zooxanthellae that live inside their bodies in exchange for a safe haven. So these transparent coral polyps, you can see these tiny little dots. Those are the zooxanthellae, and they are actually what give corals their color. However, if the water is too hot for too long, photosynthesis goes a bit haywire and damaging free radicals are produced as well as the normal things like sugar and oxygen and whatever that are produced. And the coral can't tolerate that. And this video shows you a coral polyp in an aquarium where scientists on purpose heat the water too hot for too long. And you can see the coral polyp convulsing. And it might be hard to see, but there's a cloud of what looks like dust coming out, and those are actually zooxanthellae being ejected from the coral. And eventually, you can see the mouth there. Eventually, if all the zooxanthellae are gone, you can see through the transparent tissues of the coral polyp to the white skeleton underneath, and that's what makes them look white, and that's why we call it coral bleaching. Now, coral bleaching can happen over vast spatial scales at once. And if it happens too frequently so that the corals don't have time to recover in between, then you start to get a steady decline, which is why corals are so at risk. And so we first identified this in, I think it was 1998, but these mass bleachings were fairly infrequent until recent times. So for example, on the Great Barrier Reef, we had mass bleachings in 2016, where these red dots are, 2017, and 2020. So in a very short time frame, a huge amount of the Great Barrier Reef was experiencing coral bleaching. And there's a huge literature of studies that have looked at how recovery is and isn't happening from that. And down here, you can just see an example of what corals are supposed to look like, and then if they've bleached and died. And here's a good one where you can really see how white they can look. So coral bleaching can happen to most of the world's coral reefs. From 1963 to 2015, these dots showed all the places where these researchers anyway were able to find out that coral bleaching had occurred. And the bottom one shows all the locations it was recorded just in 2016 alone. And one of the activities I do with kids is I get them to do a back of the envelope kind of calculation of how much money and how many corals you would have to grow if you were to grow replacement corals for bleaching events at different spatial scales. So for example, for just one reef, we use Lizard Island, scaling up to the whole Great Barrier Reef and then the whole world. And it's just vast amounts of money. Okay, so cyclones. The reason I wanted to mention bleaching is because the reason I'm interested in cyclones and how I study them is within that broader disturbance context. So cyclones can cause major damage to coral reefs. This map shows you the main ocean basins where they occur. We call them tropical cyclones, but they're also called hurricanes or typhoons. And they overlap with most of the areas where coral reefs also exist, except for within about 8 degrees north and south of the equator, where they can't or don't usually form or track. So they generate large waves from their extreme wind speeds blowing over the ocean. And when these waves interact with the rocky reef structures, they dissipate the bulk of their energy, and that can cause major structural damage to the reefs themselves. And this picture shows big coral bommies that have been completely ripped off the reef slope and thrown up the back of the reef above the high tide line. So that gives you a sense of the power of these waves, but there's other types of damage you can get as well. You can also get extreme rainfall events associated with cyclones, and those can generate what we call freshwater flood plumes. And this dashed red line shows you this discolored water coming off the coast, which represents a flood plume. And this can be bad because it lowers the salinity and the light, and it can smother corals with sediment. And then finally, you can get cold, nutrient-rich water coming up from deep below, and that can lead to phytoplankton blooms, which can also smother reefs, but that is less prevalent than the others. So with my research, I tend to focus on wave impacts, structural damage to reefs from wave impacts. So over time, coral reefs are repeatedly exposed to cyclones. And this map shows from 1985 to 2015 how many days per year each location across the world is typically exposed to cyclonic conditions. So gale force winds or higher, which have the capability of whipping up big seas. And then the orange shows you the locations of the coral reefs. So you can see these coral reefs close to the equator are safe. They don't get cyclones. The coral reefs in the Northwest Pacific really cop it orders of magnitude more than the other ocean basins. And then you've got Australia over here. So 62% of the world's reef area is exposed for at least 1 day per year. 55% for 5 days per year or less, and only 2% for more than 10 days per year. So there's a great spatial variability depending on where you live as a coral reef and what cyclone activity you're going to cop. And so when cyclone wave damage happens repeatedly over time, it can have a lasting effect, helping to structure an ecosystem. This is just from the Great Barrier Reef, the Ames long-term monitoring data from 1985 to 2011. These curves show coral cover over time. So this is the GBR as a whole, and then broken down into 3 regions. The red represents cyclones. So the proportion of the coral loss that could be attributed to cyclones in each of those years versus crown of thorns starfish and bleaching. So obviously we've had some big bleaching since then. So if you look at this extended on to the present, then bleaching starts to be more predominant. But in the absence of bleaching, cyclones are the major structuring disturbance. So I do a lot of work with reef ecologists, reconstructing cyclone disturbance histories so that they can try and untangle how coral cover has changed and what is likely behind that change and how that varies across space. And you can easily do the same thing from a geomorphological perspective as well. And I have worked with Sarah Hamilton of University of Wollongong on a couple of papers where I've reconstructed cyclone history, and she's used it with her field observations of geomorph as well. But this is from the Rowley Shoals and Scott Reef in Western Australia. These lines show hard coral and soft coral change over time. And then these different circles represent, the blue ones represent the hours of potentially damaging cyclone waves, and the red represent degree heating weeks. So looking at the interaction of thermal stress and cyclones. And we don't have time today, but I could, if you're interested, I can give you a bunch of examples of papers from all different areas around the world where we've done this kind of stuff. Oh, like the ones here. So at broad spatial scales, cyclones are actually relatively easy to reconstruct because they have very predictable spatial structures. There's the calm eye at the center where there's no wind. There's the eye wall where the maximum wind speeds and wave heights occur right along the boundary of that calm eye. You've got the spiraling rain bands and so forth. So if you have basic information that's freely available online, like the location of the cyclone eye and its basic characteristics, you can plug those into meteorological equations, which can be as simple as this empirical one and as complicated as a numerical physics-based model. And then you can use that to reconstruct what the cyclone likely did every hour along its track. And if you're wondering why do you have to do that, it's because the instruments that you might measure that with, wind gauges and wave buoys, often get damaged and fail because of the harsh conditions. So rarely do we have data of what an actual cyclone did. Instead, we have to reconstruct it. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, there's a lot of variability, spatial variability in what impacts actually occur. So we can model what the cyclone did. So you could think of that as the hazard, but how the actual corals react to it is a whole nother story. So here's an example of Cyclone Lua from 2012 in Western Australia. We used a numerical wave model based on an empirical wind model to reconstruct where significant wave heights were 4 meters or above, which is likely to damage reefs, but which is this huge zone. But if you delve into Scott Reef and have a look, you can see, wow, there's a clear gradient of decreasing wave energy from where the waves are approaching Scott Reef. As they interact with the hard structures of the reef, much of that wave energy is dissipated to the point in North Scott Lagoon, you've got none. Where it's more open down here, you get some propagating through. And so that translates to the biological data of how the corals responded. So at SL4 and SL3, where waves were 6 and 4 meters, you had almost complete loss of fragile branching acroporids and a pretty significant loss of these more robust porites and a big overall coral loss. But on the other side, you had virtually no loss at all. So this is one example of why it's so spatially variable. And here's another example. This is from a study from Cyclone Ida on the Great Barrier Reef. And these plots just show how coral cover changed in response to the cyclone. So where it's blue, it actually increased in coral cover, and where it's red, it decreased. So you can see there's a huge noisy relationship at the transect level because it's so variable. And then at the reef level, when you break it down between these different types of corals or growth forms, they vary in their vulnerability. But the reason I showed this particular slide is that it came out backwards to how you'd expect. Normally you expect robust brain coral types to be less vulnerable to being damaged. But in this case, almost every single one was damaged. And you expect acropora branching forms to be more vulnerable, but instead they weren't. And so this was because of the differences in size classes, because bigger sizes of colonies are more vulnerable. So if you have lots of acropora, but they're all really small because they've just recovered from a recent disturbance, then they're less vulnerable. So it's just to show you that it can be very, very tricky to untangle this and try and predict where you wouldn't expect to find damage. Okay, and Melanie mentioned in the intro that cyclones actually, if they happen at the right time, can actually beneficially cool coral reefs from thermal stress. So this is a crazy looking hurricane visualization from Hurricane Katrina from NOAA. As it spins along its track, you'll see that the sea surface temperatures, which are quite hot in red, are going to cool. Let's start at sea. So as it moves along this line, you can see this cooling start to occur, and it's asymmetrical around the track. And that's called a cool wake. And that cooled SST can persist for hours to days to months before it returns back to normal. And it's very spatially variable. So if that happens at just the right time, it can make a difference to whether or not those corals bleach. So we can reconstruct those with SST satellite data. But first, I wanted to show you, there was a field study in 2007 which showed the Florida Reef Tract experienced 4 different cyclones. And here are the circles are the study sites, and the cyclones are marked here, versus the US Virgin Islands over here, which was far from any cyclones, which are these lines. And they varied in their, well, they were both experiencing similar levels of thermal stress, which are these gray bars, but they varied significantly in how long and the magnitude of the bleaching prevalence that they had. So where the cyclones occurred, the maximum prevalence was lower and the bleaching event ended quicker. So that was the first time someone demonstrated with field data that it makes a difference. And then Adam Kerrigan, my PhD student, and I mapped that across 2 entire seasons in the Caribbean. So we used the SST data to work out the total accumulated cooling caused by cyclones. So up to 6 degrees in dark blue. And then we compared that to the accumulated thermal stress. So where you're near the Florida Reef Tract, you had cooling up to 5 degrees Celsius and degree heating weeks only up to 4 to 5, which is still bad, but not as bad as over here, where you had almost no cyclone cooling and double the amount of degree heating weeks. So this is a very useful thing we can do to try and see what's happening. And this is just telling you that the way we calculate it is to take the average SST 2 weeks before the cyclone in a given pixel and compare that to 2 weeks, 3 days after the cyclone onward. And when you subtract those, that gives you a sustained average drop in temperature that's enough to make a difference to corals and their thermal stress. And this slide is just for you spatial nerds out there, just points out that it's actually really important to consider when each pixel across an area actually experiences the cyclone, because often what people do is they look at the date the cyclone formed and count that as the start date, but that cyclone may not have been close enough to a given pixel to actually start on that day. Especially if you have a fast moving cyclone. It's really important to worry about these piddly little nuances, which is what nerdy geographers like. And so my next point is people have noticed that cooling can happen and models have to simplify reality, but I would argue that models that assume cooling happens uniformly and 100% through a cyclone's cool wake, which you can define as the radius to gale force winds, which we've done here, that is a very dangerous assumption, because if you look inside these 4 cool wakes from the Great Barrier Reef, you can see that the blue colors do not uniformly fill in that entire zone defined by the black line by that cyclone. They're super variable in magnitude and extent. And that's because winds and other characteristics of the cyclone are asymmetrical and variable as well. So of course the cooling should be variable. And then these are just examples from the opposite hemisphere, the northern hemisphere. So I did a little test of how often across 2,030 cool wakes that we reconstructed from 1985 to 2009, we could safely assume that most 90 to 100% of the area of the cool wake was actually cooled, and it was only 20%. And then if you are more realistic and you consider major cooling, so cooling of at least a sustained drop of at least 1 degree Celsius, then it's even worse. And I can't read it because everyone's faces are in the less than 5%. So that's a really serious flaw with that model assumption. So we really should publish this so that people know about it. And then finally in that work, we looked at the joint annual probability of thermal stress, so degree heating wakes of 4 or above, and minor cyclone cooling, which is the top one, and more significant cyclone cooling. So where you've got blue or a value of 1, it means you have a 100% chance that some beneficial cooling will happen every season. But for major cooling, you never reach that. And the Northwest Pacific is where you get that the most. So obviously we need to update this because this goes to 2009, update it to 2021, because I think these probabilities will increase because we've had more thermal stress. Okay, so then how will cyclone activity change with warming? There's a whole bunch of things that influence what cyclones do. Some of them help them form and some of them limit their formation. One that limits the formation is wind shear. And this just shows you a map of how spatially variable the expected changes in wind shear are. So it's complicated trying to predict how cyclones are going to change in future. This comes from a 2019 report. It just shows projections for a 2-degree global warming. Lots of people keep saying that cyclones are going to become more frequent, and that's not actually true. If you look at this, the frequency is going down in every basin and globally as a whole. But of the cyclones that do form, more are likely to reach higher intensities. So all of these are going up. And they are likely to generate more rain as well. So those are things we reasonably kind of know, but there's a lot of things we really don't know. You can take the existing information of where cyclones have been tracking over the recent past and calculate the return intervals, so the expected number of years between events, and intersect those with coral ecoregions. So these red ecoregions are the ones where they're expected to cop cyclones that are big and strong, so super damaging every 5 years or less. And the blue ones are much further apart, so safer. And then the yellow dots from this paper, based on what's written in the literature of how cyclones are expected to change, are ones where you'd expect that might become a shorter return interval or happen more frequently. But that's kind of a rough way of doing it. I'm working with colleagues in the UK. We've got a paper in review where for the Australian region, we've used synthetic or fake cyclone tracks pulled out of climate models. And we use 6 different climate models to look at how the intensity, size, and duration of cyclones might change in the near future and the longer term future. So it looks like intensity generally expected to go up, and size. But interestingly, with duration, initially it's supposed to go down and then go up. But one thing to keep in mind, which this paper of ours does, is try to get a handle of how much skill do these models actually have. And one way to do that is to compare to the known observed historical data, and that's the red lines. So these are the Coral Sea, the Great Barrier Reef, Northern Territory, and Western Australia for 4 different types of damaging cyclones. And you can see the red lines don't match the other lines, and the models are all different from each other. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty in these future tracks. We have to be careful. We can't just use them and assume that they're correct. And this just kind of shows that in another way. It's a kernel density plot where most of the cyclone tracks should be inside the green polygon for Western Australia, for example. And so you can compare those colored polygons on the observed data to the modeled ones, and they're wild. Like they sort of match a little, but not really. So the danger is there are data sets out there like this one where people have generated thousands and thousands of synthetic future tracks and then run cyclone wind fields and then use those to run numerical wave models at a 10-meter resolution for the entire GBR. And in this case, calculating the duration of damaging waves, so how long damaging conditions last versus the maximum wave heights. And this is an example of Green Island on the GBR. Here's its shallowest spot, and then it's deeper at the front. The top plot here under the current climate is every 10 years. So that's a common cyclone event. And this one's every 100, which is a rare one. And so you can see you get under the rare events, it's this part of Green Island that cops the longest lasting damaging waves, and maximum wave height. Similarly, it's that little bit that cops it the most. But what was interesting about looking at this data was, despite the widespread kind of idea people have that cyclones are going to become more damaging to reefs, when you subtract the future and the past, so compare them, you get this color, which is no change. So there's hardly any change across either of these for any of these scenarios, a 4.5 or an 8.5. And here's just more examples starting at the north of the GBR going all the way down. And I'm in the process of analyzing all this data to see what the overall trends are. However, noting that huge spatial uncertainty in whether those tracks of where the cyclone went were actually correct. So it makes you wonder whether it's worth doing all this analysis. But interesting. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears in the time left to talk about outreach. And I thought I'd start with penguins because everyone loves penguins. I went with Homeward Bound to the Antarctic Peninsula. We saw 3 species of penguins, the gentoo, the irrepressible Adelies, and the chinstrap penguins. And kids always love this one. Yes, that is a baby penguin pooping. So Homeward Bound, as I mentioned, is an international leadership program for women in STEM, taking roughly 100 women each year through a leadership program to build a network of women ready to take our place to try and lead for the greater good. There's an online component for about a year and then a voyage to Antarctica. And I did my voyage in January of 2019. So why should Homeward Bound try to create more women leaders? Well, if you think about the problems we're facing, even just on today, as we were chatting about at the beginning, clearly we need to do something different with leadership because we're not really solving these major existential crises that are threatening humanity and all of the Earth's biodiversity. And it turns out that there's a huge literature in the business world that has looked at what makes effective problem solving within teams. And they found at the company level, for example, that gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to outperform than otherwise, and ethnically diverse ones even more. There was actually a study in Science that created, I think, 40 teams of out of 699 people and set them each 2 different tasks, and then measured characteristics of the collective intelligence of the team as well as their performance on the tasks. And they found that it was a function of the average social sensitivity of the team members, their equality and taking turns talking, and the proportion of women in the group. So it's about the mix of different ideas and perspectives and how they can be used to inform the problem solving that makes a team more effective. And this is just an example from the conservation literature. This is from Nature Climate Change. 440 indigenous forest users from Indonesia, Peru, and Tanzania were put into teams that were either male dominated, which is normal for those places, or gender balanced. And what they found was the gender balanced teams worked together to actually conserve more trees than the male dominated ones. And they were able to share the payment, that there was a payment for ecosystem services as a reward for conserving trees. And that was shared more equally in the gender diverse teams. So that's why Homeward Bound is trying to do this and bring more women so that we can all benefit. It's not a criticism of men. It's a positive statement to build a better future together. So then I just wanted to show you some highlights from my outreach. One of the crazy things I did was wear a coral polyp costume and talk to a penguin in front of icebergs.
I bet you don't know what I am. I am a coral polyp, and these are my zooxanthellae. And my question for you is, what do penguins and coral reefs have in common? We don't like warming seas. This coral polyp has gone all the way to Antarctica to escape coral bleaching. So come on, world, let's stop those greenhouse gases.
I'm recording.
So I promised that I would do that to one of my sponsors.
Thank you.
But the reason I show that is I think when you're engaging with people, but especially kids, about topics that are really serious and potentially scary, it's really important to have an element of fun and play with it. And even for adults, I find it better to think of climate change when I'm wearing a coral polyp costume. Also, studies have shown that teaching kids about climate change not only is fair because they deserve to understand what's happening and to have a voice, but it also provides a pathway to understanding to adults that otherwise might be resistant. And that's what this shows. So 92 control and 196 treatment groups of parents. So the controls, they were interviewed before and after the treatment group had a climate change education program for their kids. And this just tracks how their attitudes and concern about climate change. So the biggest change was for the fathers, the very conservative fathers of young daughters. Interesting. But this showed me that it was worth it to reach out to kids for multiple reasons. So I do all kinds of crazy things with them, combining art and play with science. So we make coral colonies of different types out of Lego, and we discover that different type of corals have different vulnerabilities to wave damage, for example. For younger kids, we make corals out of white Play-Doh, and then they add colored bits onto them so that they can make sugar and keep their coral alive. One fun thing is I dress up in my coral polyp costume and I let kids rip off my zooxanthellae to make me turn white and bleach. And we've got a giant fake thermometer, and then I get a kid to like make it cool off. And then I say, oh, I'm starving because I'm missing 95% of my energy. Please put back Musos and Theli so I can live. And then they all run up and do it. And I've actually done that in an audience of a whole bunch of marine scientists at work, and they just went even more berserk than the kids did. So it's a fun way to get across a kind of complicated concept of how corals work through an interactive activity. Oops. Okay, so then I decided to do these drawing contests to reach out to more kids and their associated adults. So in 2018, in the lead up to my voyage to Antarctica, I asked kids to draw what they love most about penguins and coral reefs, just as a way to let their voices be heard about climate change. And so we got 1,246 drawings from 11 countries and 120 schools. We mosaicked that to form a picture of a dabbing penguin. I printed it in 5 sections, and my husband sewed them together. I took it to Antarctica. We videoed it at a penguin colony and on the deck of the ship in the iceberg-strewn waters around the Antarctic Peninsula. So that was good. But then I decided last year that that isn't enough to just raise awareness that they care about this. I want to give them a pathway to an action to show them if you reach out to with other people in community, you can make a bigger impact than you can do by yourself, and it makes you feel good to do that. So we ran a drawing contest called Plant a Tree, Cool the Earth, and for every drawing kids did about what they love most about trees and how they can help cool the earth, an organization called 15 Trees planted a tree in Victoria, and we planted those last year. These are just some examples of some of the amazing drawings. So this is a fun video. We made these crazy fun videos as we went along to keep the interest.
This earth is too hot.
We dressed up as T-Rexes and
Earth
penguins and things.
Penguins, coral reefs, and people. But trees can help cool the earth. We can plant trees. Kids around the world are drawing pictures of trees. And we at kidscareaboutclimate.org are planting a tree for each one of them. Join us by 30th of June.
Roar!
So at that stage, we had that many entries, but in the end, we got 2,629 drawings from 33 nations and 213 schools, which was twice as many drawings, 3 times as many countries, and around twice as many.
2,629 drawings from 33
Show you how we did the mosaic of the new banner.
Mosaic to form a cool picture of a penguin on an earth. We split those into 5 panels, printed them each out at Uniprint. I was very excited. And then, there they are, the 5 bits. My husband sewed them together on an industrial sewing machine to form this 7-meter by 4-meter banner. And it even has its special carry bag with the sponsor logos, which are...
Oh, you don't need to know the sponsor.
15 Trees, 2006.
Next one. Okay, so then this is the grand premiere of the banner.
2,629 drawings from 33 countries and 213 schools. The giant banner made from these had its world premiere at Beaumaris Primary School in Perth, which had 513 entries. We celebrated with a drone photo, doing the tree pose, and giving ourselves a pat on the back. The banner, some of the drawings for Beaumaris are shown here, is on its way to the United Nations climate meeting, and then it's going to tour the Daintree rainforest in North Queensland, as well as all kinds of forests around Australia and the world. Look out for it. Go to kidscareaboutclimate.org.
Okay, and then this is it in the Daintree rainforest and all around North Queensland. So
Hey everybody, kids need you to help cool the earth.
To help,
That's in
we
Cairns,
created
the
a
mangrove
giant
forest.
7-meter by 4-meter banner of kids' drawings. 2,629 kids from 33 countries drew what they love most about trees as a way to cool the earth. We took it to the rainforest at the Daintree Rainforest Observatory in Australia. Wow, so how high are we?
What do you reckon? 40?
40 meters. The staff at James Cook University kept us safe up in the air. Yay, we did it! We're in the wind hole.
It was
Giant banner
hard
of
to
kids'
unfurl
drawings
it.
about trees gently unfurled and caught the wind.
It was gentle
And
that
we hope
time.
that this will remind world leaders and people everywhere that we need to keep trees that already exist and plant new trees, as well as other ways to help cool our earth. Hey,
So then we made a special video. We visited a bunch of schools and a bunch of kids and forests, and we made a video of it all and played it at COP26, and one of the banners was there. This is the dramatic music.
Oh, it's getting hot here on Earth, and that's no good for you, is it, Penguin? No.
So many amazing drawings. OMG, it's the giant banner. It's coming out. It was hard to get the money to pay for that thing.
We want a safe place for our animals to live. We want cleaner air to breathe. You all need to make a stand, including you. Please save the trees! Leaders of the world, kids have a message for you as you attend COP26.
We need to stop using carbon emissions.
We need to make the change. We don't want our sea levels to rise.
so here we go, up in the canopy crane.
Hello world leaders. Us kids, we don't really have a say, but we can still make a stand.
This is our future and we demand a say of how to make it better.
Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to tell you was that one of the grand prize winning drawings has been made into a flag, and it's on board a yacht called Climate Action Now. And this amazing woman, Lisa Blair, is attempting to break the world record for solo and unassisted circumnavigation of Antarctica. And so she's going to sign that drawing and send it back to that kid in Sri Lanka after she's done. In 120 days, you can follow her journey. It's just so inspirational. And we're not done. Things we've got planned for this year are going to be to meet up with author Meg Lohman at her Rainforest Canopy Walkway in Malaysia, Singapore, Tasmania, Adelaide, around the US, maybe New South Wales as well, and Egypt. And that is it. Stop. Done.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. Yeah, what amazing work you're doing, inspiring those kids and creating action on climate change. That's incredible. We lost a few people at the top of the hour, but if anyone has any questions, then please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask them, or you can pop it in the chat. So that was incredible. Do you ever get children asking you what job or what career they should go into if they were going to have the maximum effect on climate change?
That's interesting that none of them have asked me that. I wonder why that is. Usually what I get is kids saying, oh, I want to be a scientist. But yeah, I do say to kids, for example, lots of kids want to study marine biology and be around coral reefs and dolphins and whales and stuff like that. And there's a lot of pathways you can follow to do that, where you don't necessarily have to be a marine biologist. So data science, computer science, and geography are all proving to be really, really helpful, working hand in hand with marine biologists to better understand our marine biodiversity and ecosystems. So that's another thing they can do if they want to be involved in the marine environment. But yeah, that's interesting. I might bring that up.
Yeah, it's just something that I've thought about as well, like what the best career choice would be. And it's interesting when you start thinking about it, it's like, oh, is it politics or is it, I don't.
Yeah,
yeah.
I guess one of the things that I came out of Homeward Bound with, which I ran out of time to really talk about, is that there's so many ways to make an impact, and the best impact you personally can possibly make is going to be different from everyone else. And the key to it is to understanding what are your core values. So not what society tells you or you think society is telling you it should be, or what other people want you to do, but what you actually feel like. If I do X, Y, and Z, I will feel fulfilled, like I've been true to myself. So if you spend some time working that out, then if you consistently act, so when you decide to take any action, you check to see, does that further those values that are so important to me? And if it does, do it. If it doesn't, don't. And then the third key step is that you then make that visible to other people. Let other people see that that's what you're doing. And people get really inspired by that. To do the same thing, not necessarily do exactly what you're doing, but to find their own values and to act towards them, to bring their best self to the world. And I think that's being a leader, not thinking you know all the answers and guiding everyone to where you think they should go. And so therefore, anyone can be a leader at any level in any organization. And I often think that our junior scientists who are doing their PhDs and postdocs show a lot of the leadership within our organization, for example, because they're more in touch, with what they're trying to do. But you co-create the change you want to see with other people in community. You empower each other rather than impose. So yeah.
That's an amazing an insightful view on leadership. It just really rings true. As soon as you hear it, you're like, oh yes, of course, that just sounds like, makes a lot of sense. Yeah, incredible. I might just ask one more question if we don't have any questions from the audience. And this is a rather naive question from someone who's not got anything to do with coral. But as the climate changes and the oceans warm, does that mean that coral reefs, obviously it's going to be devastating for the Great Barrier Reef and many reefs globally, but will reefs grow further south or further away from the equator? Is that a really naive way to look at it?
No, that's a great question. And people have looked at that. There have been studies, they call that range shifts. So it's a relevant question for any ecosystem on land or in the sea. So for example, in Tasmania, they're finding that a lot of creatures are getting carried down by the currents, and instead of dying in the winter because it's too cold, they're surviving and they're devastating the giant kelp.
Oh.
Full of range shifts happening with those organisms. But yeah, with coral reefs, it can happen. I mean, they do have a minimum temperature requirement, but they also need to have a suitable substrate, we call it, to attach to. So some hard, solid ground. Because the minute that when they float around as larvae, they're buffeted around by the waves, and obviously they can easily be destroyed. So the first chance they get, they attach onto something hard and they start secreting their own external skeleton, which I forgot to say when I was giving my spiel. So they actually do that their entire life. And it's those tiny little creatures that build those entire giant rocky structures. So for them to be able to range shift, there needs to be suitable structures for them to attach to. And the ocean currents need to be favorable to take them to those locations. But there was a paper that came out a few years ago now that showed some limited evidence for that happening in Western Australia. So yeah, that is possible. There's also a lot of work being done to try and help corals adapt to the hotter temperatures. But the only issue with that is just the mismatch in scale, which I kind of alluded to in that example, because you can have bleaching happen at such a vast spatial scale really quickly, and to try and replace all those corals with heat adapted ones in time is tricky. But on the other hand, it's good to have that technology and be able to do that, even if only in a few small areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow,
That
so
was a great question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's wonderful. We might draw to a close, but thank you so much. That was a wonderful and interesting seminar, very inspiring as well. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you so much for inviting me.